I think I'll see if I can shout it aloud instead of using the microphone. So thank you for inviting me. It's a great honor. I've entitled the talk Attention, Economics, and Bubble Studies. I'll go through the attention part first, and then I get to the bubbles in the end. A particular kind of bubbles that we sometimes also call fake news. You don't have to take notes because I prepared it in such a way that you can buy the book and the t-shirt and the yo-yo and other items about this particular talk, because our book, which is called Fake News, just came out in German as Faktisch, so that's actually available, came out last month. And if you're more interested in the social psychology of these affairs and bubble studies, then there's the book on the right called Infostorms. Now, let me start a different place altogether. So, I don't know if you know, but there's 5 billion pieces of information shared on Facebook every day, 340 hours of video uploaded to YouTube every minute, 2 trillion tweets a year. So it's not like that we don't have information, and then you can talk about all the digital information that we have, the online platforms that we can consult, online encyclopedias, news feeds, online boards, and so forth. So there's never been so much information in the world as there is today. However, just because we have more information available doesn't necessarily mean that we get more enlightened, nor that our decision, or the basis on which we base our decision, has become more clear. And Joey Novick, who's an American comedian, actually pretty funnily commented on this some years ago. He said that the information in the world doubles every day, but what they don't tell us is that our wisdom is cut in half at the same time. Now, clearly, if the information age is also a result of the Enlightenment age, and if you ask Kant and Rousseau and the rest of the free thinkers what would happen if you gave people information at their fingertips, and the result would be more polarization, and the result would be more echo chambering, the result would be fake news and other things, then maybe both Kant and Rousseau and the rest would have dreamt themselves back to the Middle Ages, which actually they were using information to free and autonomize every individual with. So from that perspective, there's a price to be paid for information. And what we also know about it is that, of course, information is not regulated in any particular way. There is not a state body that will tell you what information you can post and what information you can't post. But of course, all of us who have access to the social media, for instance, all of us who have a profile on, say, Facebook, clearly all of us sat down and read those 36 pages, right? There's community standards that you have to sign before you start up your profile. And those will actually be editorial guidelines that Facebook are actually setting for what you can and cannot write. But clearly the way it's administered on a daily basis is pretty lenient, if not arbitrary. And so from that perspective, if you can't get out on Facebook, you can start your own blog or start your own cloud and say whatever you want. So there's a certain element of the information market looked upon as a market, as sort of a free market. Now, the question is it really free? And what does that mean exactly? What sort of experiences do we have with free markets? And as you know, back in the early 2000s, Alan Greenspan, who was chairman of the American Federal Bank, had an idea, which is not new, but an idea that we should deregulate and liberalize markets. And the idea is basically that you can feed into the efficient market hypothesis, so whatever the price of an asset is all the information that is needed to make a qualified decision as to whether to buy or sell. So from that perspective, there's total transparency given the information that the pricing sort of reflects about that asset. And the reason why you should deregulate and liberalize would be that in a very liquid market where people trade a lot, in the end it will come out in such a way that only the good services and the good products will survive, and the bad ones will get weeded out given the liquidity of the market, given the rationality in the investors, and given sort of the inbound efficient market hypothesis of the market. Now, then when everything crashed in 2008, Alan Greenspan actually had to realize and come very clear about the fact that that doesn't quite work like that. Bad financial products can actually live for quite some time in a deregulated, liberalized market. Read, say, products or monetary products like subprime loans. Yeah. And that actually sort of crashed the market very, very strongly. Look at the information market as also a market for information products. And the question is in such a market where it's actually very liberalized and deregulated, is it such that only the good information will survive and the bad information will get weeded out given the liquidity of us exchanging our opinions and ideas and so forth? And the answer is unfortunately no. Bad information can live for quite some time in a deregulated market. Read, for instance, bad information products like, say, fake news. As a semantical entity, it's a pretty interesting kind of concept, fake news, because it's a semantical product for which it is dressed up as if it was truthful or dressed up as journalism and truthfulness, but in the end, if you look at it, it's either lies, and lies are nice because a liar at least acknowledges there's a difference between true and falsity. But as you also may know, that in 2005, a philosophy professor from Princeton, Harry Frankfurt, wrote a little book which you could buy at any Barnes & Noble checkout back in the days where there were still Barnes & Nobles to actually check them out from. It was called, excuse my French, On Bullshit. And that, if you haven't read that book, you should. It's a very interesting book in which he does a semantical analysis of the notion of a proposition being bullshit. And a BS proposition is a proposition for which the sender doesn't care whether or not it's true or false. Basically, you don't acknowledge that there is a difference between true and false, so you can actually mix truth and falsity as you please because you're not committed to a distinction of there being a binary choice between true and false, or even a continuum between true and false. So you just don't accept it. Now, the way we define fake news as a semantical entity in the post-factish book is that it's either lies or bullshit dressed up as journalism and so simulating truthfulness. And from that perspective, even Harry Frankfurt also says it's a much more poisonous product from an epistemological point of view or a logical point of view than, say, lying. Or even, say, rumors or doctoring or fingering various concepts of truth. Simply because you are not committed to what you say. It doesn't matter whether it's true or false. And from that perspective, this particular kind of information, which is BS, and so fake news, can actually live for quite some time in a deregulated, liberalized market. And if you're looking at the analysis of the information that we have about what sort of information actually strived during the American election online, the most singular read news story pertaining to the American election was #Pizzagate. And I don't know if you know this story, but it's a story about there being a child prostitution ring in the basement of a pizza restaurant in Washington, frequented by everybody from the Democratic National Convention, and the childs that were there were actually some that Bill Clinton picked up in Haiti when he was helping during the catastrophe. It's a complete nonsense conspiracy theory story, but it's the most widely transmitted story during the election. It's clearly false. It's clearly also BS, but a lot of it was dressed up as if it was truthful. So there is a market for such information. Now, if you look at this particular information market, you will also see that already back in 1971, and I was 1 year old at that time, Herbert Simon, who was a Nobel Prize laureate from 1978 in economics, prophetically said about the information age to come. This is what he says in 1971. He says, in an information-rich world, you're going to find a scarcity of something else. A scarcity of whatever it is that information consumes. But what information consumes is rather obvious. It consumes the attention of its recipients. So there's an asymmetrical relationship between the amount of information available and the attention that we can allocate to this information. And the problem with that is that attention as a resource is a very weird sort of resource compared to, say, monetary resources. Because first of all, it's a zero-sum game when you use it. Right? We don't multitask very well. So if I have attention on you, I don't have it on you. And that basically means what I gain on you, I lose out on you. So it's a zero-sum game when you exchange it or you use it. You can aggregate it and save it for a rainy day. So once you use it, it's burned off, and there's nothing more to it than that. So as opposed to monetary assets, which don't necessarily result in zero-sum games, nor are actually something that you cannot save up, it's a very limited resource, and also there are only 24 hours in a day, so there's only this much time that you have available. And that means if there is an exponential rise in the amount of information, but you still only have 24 hours in a day, clearly you're going to find a clash between the amount of information available in the time you have. So there is a very, very strong competition for gaining people's attention online in the information age. And the problem with that is, of course, also that attention as an asset online is not normally distributed. It's not like height or weight or something like that, where the bulk of us can actually allocate the same amount of or height or weight, where we actually all are normal distributions. But attention as an asset is not normally distributed. It's distributed according to a whole different set of laws. So if I were to ask you, just to get a feel for what that means exactly, is if the person in the Western Hemisphere with the most followers on social media, do you know who that person would be? In the Western Hemisphere. 250 million followers, give or take. Zuckerberg, no, not even. He's not even among top 5. It's no Donald Trump either. It's no Mother Teresa. No, 250 million. I have the top 5 for you with me here. It's actually Taylor Swift. Taylor Swift is a singer. Good question. Now you can think of this particular ranking as you please. You go from 100, 250 million. Cristiano Ronaldo, you know who that guy is, right? Okay, so just to say, it's Taylor Swift, Cristiano Ronaldo, who's a football player, Katy Perry, who's a singer, Selena Gomez, who's a singer, and Rihanna, who's also a singer. Good. Now you can think about this ranking as you please and find it devastating or not. That's not important. But what is important is that in the first top 5 ranking, you lose 100 million followers, right? You go from 250 million to 150 million followers, yeah? So in the first 5 places, you lose out on 100 million followers. And from there on out, if the tailing starts going really fast, okay? So that means that there's a bulk of people, a small concentration of people who have the bulk of attention of followers. And then it weeds out very quickly. Now that tells you a little bit of what kind of distribution that we have when it comes to followers, but also on traffic on the web. As I was explaining to you before, most of human characteristics of the natural ones that we know of follow normal distributions. Yes, so take intelligence. There's a few people out there who's extremely intelligent. There's also a very few who's really stupid, but most of us are here in the middle. And so a lot of assets, or a lot of human traits have this nature. But that's not the way it goes with monetary assets. Many of you, of course, know Thomas Piketty's The Capital, right? And if you're, I know it's 800 pages, but there's a lot of messages. But one of the important messages in the book is the following, namely that 1% of the world's population are sitting with 50% of all the goods. And then the 99% must fight for whatever is left, the remaining 50%. And that's also the reason why the World Economic Forum and the OECD and the UN, etc., have been out saying that inequality is now to be considered a global challenge because wealth is so unequally distributed. Now, the interesting thing about it is that means that monetary assets or assets follows not a normal distribution, but what's called a power law. That's one of these. So here you have Selena Gomez, Rihanna, and the rest, and then all the rest is just panning out in the tail. Yeah? Now, that also goes on the macroscopic level. I don't know if you know of it, but all traffic online, 90% of all traffic online is between 5 actors, or 6, depending on how you read the conglomerates. Facebook, YouTube, Google, Instagram, and Twitter are running away with 90% of all the traffic online. And then everybody else would fight for whatever is left in the tail. And there's only one example of a company that starts out down in the end of this tail of this distribution and works its way up, reasonably way up. That's Pinterest. Everybody else gets bought up before they any amount to something. So what does Facebook do when they feel threatened? Well, they buy WhatsApp and Instagram. What about Google? Well, Google buy YouTube. And what does Amazon.com do? They buy Washington Post. Or rather, Joe Bezos buy Washington Post. Right? And so it's not only books and yo-yos and hula hoops, it's potentially also political products being sold. Now, there is, of course, a distinction between Amazon.com and Washington Post on the other hand, but Donald Trump is very well aware that you can hit Amazon by criticizing, or you can hit Washington Post by criticizing Amazon.com. And did he do that? Yes. 3 weeks ago, he was out to say that Amazon.com is actually threatening the United States Postal Services in terms of transportation of packages. And what happened? over a weekend, Amazon.com lost $60 billion worth of value on stock. So these things are now connected. And the problem is about attention as an asset is attention is also heavily distributed according to power law distributions. And the big ones tend to get even bigger. And the ones who are already big get even bigger. Now, here's a graph of the attention allocated by CBS to the different candidates of the US election. I don't need to tell you if you can't read it, but Donald Trump is the light blue one. And then there's everybody else. And Leon Moves, who is CEO of CBS, said, it might not be good to have Donald Trump as a candidate for America, but it's really good for CBS. And he would be right, in the sense of saying there are extremes amount of attention that was allocated to Donald Trump as opposed to every other agenda on the candidate list. Now, because it's not about having good attention or bad attention, it's about a lot of attention or little attention. And that is, of course, stimulated by the way in which the power law distributions work. So the inertia of the mathematics does not care whether it's good or bad attention. It's a lot or little. And that actually only stimulates the way in which the power distribution gets even vaster and vaster. If you look at the stories that tend to get a lot of attention, I have just brought a few of them. Here's a very interesting story from 2013 from the Associated Press. It was a hack of the Associated Press that was fed a tweet to the extent that Barack Obama had been hit in an attack on the White House. It was totally bogus. It was hacked. It was a hacked piece of information in the Associated Press, but it actually had quite an impact on the American stock market. According to USA Today, the American stock market lost $200 billion in 5 minutes, and it was a hoax. Okay? And there are multiple examples in which, for instance, wrongful information can create havocs of financial nature. I also brought one from Denmark that got a lot of attention internationally. It was the introduction of a law, and I remember the Germans were also looking at this going, this is odd. It was the introduction of a law that refugees coming across the border should have their jewelry confiscated by the authorities. I don't know if you know of this story. And I don't have to tell you that this was a very controversial proposition, but it was not only a proposition, it was put into law. Now, ever since it was installed a few years ago, it has only been used 4 times. And to the tune of about 10,000 euros of confiscation. So it's very limited. But the attention allocated to the story was vast. Okay, so there you have it again. These vast attention allocators, independently of whether truthful information is among them. Vast attention allocators of promises, say build a wall, lock her up, and you name it. Singular proposals which are probably not realizable, but they attract the attention and set the agenda. And from that perspective, you can build bubbles where what you're trading in is not really money directly, but it is attention allocation. And then you can convert attention allocation to other assets, whether that's influence, power, money, etc. And of course, this is helped on the way by a different business feature of the way in which information gets transmitted these days. If you walk back to our Herbert Simon's Nobel laureate insight, namely that attention and information is asymmetrically refined to each other, then if you look at the business model of the social media, it's pretty clear. Let me ask you first of all, how many of you have social profiles on social media? Right, a lot of us, right? And from that perspective, we are all, excuse my French, suckers. Insofar as to say, if we were to think that we were the customers of the social media, we would be thinking wrongly. Because usually when we think of customers, we think of somebody who pays. And when we think of paying, we think of paying in a monetary way usually. We don't pay for our profiles in a monetary manner, but it doesn't mean that we get it for free. We just pay in a different sort of currency. The currency in which we pay is by attention and is by data. And that's the reason why we have all these discussions about Cambridge Analytica and profiling and whatnot and big data stuff. Now, what is the simple business model of the social media? Well, if attention is the prime asset, what do? Well, get the users to generate some information that other users then use their attention on, then take that attention, buck it up, and sell it to the ones that are really paying for it, namely the advertisers. Those are the ones paying. But that basically means that you turn the users into the products. You are the one being sold on the social media on the social media profiles. You also get something back, but what is really being sold is you and your attention and your data. And the good thing about that, of course, is that generates a lot of traffic, and it's very hard to get out of. Right after the Cambridge Analytica scandal, everybody wanted to criticize Facebook. Good. It was hashtag delete Facebook. That was the trending hashtag. Where was that trending? On Facebook. But that goes to show the ones who are actually controlling public space. Public space is also this, but it's morally controlled by the ones who can actually connect people and make them into products and then sell their attention. So the business model is, of course, also like in a casino. How do you make sure that you keep making your money? Well, you have to ask people to keep coming back, because sometimes, ever so often in a casino, a big whale is going to come by and he's going to she's going to take out a big chunk of the money that the casino has. So those are not the ones that you make your money on. The ones you make your money on is just a regular person coming in and keep him playing, keep him coming back. In the end, we take it all. That is basically what Robert De Niro says in the movie Casino. And that is the way in which the social media platforms are making their buck. So if we look at it from the information as information market these days, there's a couple of conclusions we can draw already, namely that the prime asset is attention, that attention is distributed not according to normal distribution, but to power laws, that the information market is not necessarily efficient. I will get back to that. And then you make the users as a product. And what do you get out of that? Well, happy hour for all sort of bubble phenomena, from influence for the assumption of a lot of influence because you have a lot of traction with followers, to bad information products, which in the end turn out to be subprime insofar as this truth can't follow, but the attention is allocated, read, say, something like fake news. So there's a very strong analogy between bad financial products and bad information products, but we just change monetary value to attention value, and then basically you see some of the same traits of this particular kind of market. Now, the question is also, what works? How do you allocate people's attention? Well, there are actually some very interesting studies of that. Those are not some of the ones that we have been studying at the Center for Information and Bubble Studies, but we are using a lot of the results. Jonah Berger, who is an American marketing professor from the Wharton Institute, the same place where actually Donald Trump is also from, did a very interesting survey where he categorized 3,700 news stories in the New York Times as to the amount of traction these different stories got. And then he categorized them afterwards as to different parameters. And one of the parameters along which he actually characterized them was according to which emotions these stories set off. So from psychology, we know that there are positive emotions, or positive sentiments and negative sentiments. There are activity mobilizing sentiments, and there are activity demobilizing sentiments. So the sense of happiness is a positive activity demobilizing sentiment. So if you write out on your blog today, I'm really happy, nobody will share that, especially maybe your immediate network, but otherwise nobody will care. However, if you write out, there's a conspiracy going on between X, Y, and Z, then people tend to get angry and they will respond. So whatever feeds into people's activity mobilizing sentiments. And that's also what you're using. We have some very strong researchers at the Technical University of Denmark, which actually is doing studies with us. Soon as one of them, where he's actually doing sentiment analysis on Twitter feeds to see what moods people are in. And you can actually map that very delicately pertaining to exactly how or what words that they use in the different Twitter feeds. So people are usually happy in the morning and angry at night. And then, of course, there are also the demographical differences as to where they live in the US, just to take that as an example. So you can actually measure this very strongly. Anger and indignation are one of the top scores of emotions being transmitted for for news stories. Fear, fascination, anger, indignation, and fear as negative activity mobilizing sentiments. And then fascination and awe as positive activity mobilizing sentiments, perhaps also something like sympathy is also one of them. I brought you some examples of this. The most retweeted tweet ever is this one here. That's when Barack Obama wins the second term. That's also a good story to be told, right? This is a story about, love is intact on the peak of power. Who would not want to share that? That's sort of a typical fascination awe type of story. This is also very known, the second one here, but not for the better. I don't know if you know the story of Justin Seiko. So Justin Seiko is she was, I'd rather say, a communications executive at a big New York-based communication company. And she was going to South Africa on vacation, so she flew from from JFK to Heathrow, and then 11 hours along the axis from Heathrow to Joburg. And when she's sitting in Heathrow, I don't know what she is, but maybe she's bored, she writes out to her network on Twitter, "Going to Africa, hope I don't get AIDS, just kidding, I'm white." Folds up the phone and flies 11 hours along the axis. And by the time she opens her phone up back down in Johannesburg, she's lost her job, her boyfriend has left her, the people she was going to visit in Joburg don't want to have her there, and apparently there was so much social transmission of this tweet that somebody in those 11 hours figured out where she was going and live streamed in Joburg when she opened her phone and saw her world falling apart. But it only goes to show that anger works really well. And I was talking to a Danish biologist, Lone Frank, the other day, and I was asking him, or some time ago, I was asking him, look, how come we have so many activity mobilizing sentiments of a negative nature? And the obvious answer for that is, it's good for survival, right? It's good for survival to be either angry or indignated or feared, etc. So it's not too surprising that the catalog of activity mobilizing sentiments of a negative nature is pretty strong. Of course, everything is not just a bad story or a dystopia. So here is also a very, very transmitted story. Take two things that seem pretty boring. The ballistic trajectory of projectiles, unless you're a physicist, you might not find that too interesting, and water slides. Now take those two things and combine them together, and you get this, which is highly transmitted. I think that's pretty funny. Now, question, would you retweet this story? And a lot would. It's been watched 6 or 7 million times. But both Nature and the Danish Engineer and the Danish Engineer paper have been out showing this is not even possible. Okay? So it's a hoax story. But that doesn't matter. The point is basically this, that there's a lot of other reasons for retweeting or commenting or sharing information than truth. Whatever is viral is not necessarily true, and whatever is true is not necessarily viral. And that is really a disconcerting feature of the information age, right? Because most of us academics think that truth sells itself. But no, truth does not necessarily give rise to an activity mobilizing sentiment. Sometimes it might, sometimes it might not. But there are certain things which will do and get extreme amounts of attention, although of course it might necessarily be true. Now, how does this feed into a greater scheme? And if you look at the characteristic of attention economics in, say, the messaging of a political nature, how can you build a political bubble insofar as to say that normally when we think of bubbles, we think, of course, of situations in finance in which assets, that could be real estate or stock, is traded at prices that far exceeds its fundamental value. Okay? So we have to have an understanding of fundamental value, and we have to have an understanding of what it means to be traded, and we have to have an understanding of a few other concepts. So if you take the price of a political message as the attention being allocated, that could be high or low, depending. The fundamental value is as to whether or not this is possibly realizable. Say, build a wall is probably hard, but changing labor politics might be easier, then you can actually do schemes of political bubbles that tend to look a lot like the ones that we find in finance. I'm not going to go into those details right now. I will talk a little bit about politics here at the end and bubbles. I love this picture here, right? Nobody cares about the candidate, but everybody cares about themselves, right? So it's a little bit, enough about me, what about you? What do you think of me? And that is actually very telling of this idea that is making the users the product, yeah? Because now they can transmit that. Now, as I was explaining to you before, the most read story during the American election was this hashtag Pizzagate story, which was strongly transmitted. It actually stems from a hack from WikiLeaks. John Podesta, who was Hillary Clinton's campaign manager, his account was hacked in October 2016 and was put online by WikiLeaks. And when you brush through the papers, the story is sort of interesting because when you brush through the papers, there was a lot of discussions of pizza places in Washington, D.C., particularly this particular pizza place called Comet Ping Pong Pizza. And the reason why it was called Comet Ping Pong Pizza was because you could play table tennis while you were waiting for your pizza to get done. Now, I don't know if you know, and the logo of this particular pizza place were two table tennis bats standing like this. Now, I don't know if you know, but the international underground sign for child abuse and pornography is the butterfly. So that looks a little bit like two. And so a story started to proliferate to the extent that in the basement of this Comet Ping Pong Pizza, there was a child prostitution ring, et cetera, et cetera. And in that child prostitution ring, New York Times did a very detailed analysis of it. There was cannibalism going on and Satanism and possibly pedophilia. Obama was involved and Hillary Clinton and the Democratic operatives and John Podesta and everybody, right? And it's like connecting the dots in one of those line drawings that you got from a child, right? So you have certain information and then you put it in a certain order and then you see the beast all of a sudden. Now, who cares about these conspiracy stories? They're all over the place. However, this one here is particularly disconcerting because in December of 2016, a young man went from North Carolina with his automatic gun and his automatic weapon and his Glock to self-investigate whether or not there was a child prostitution ring in the basement of this particular pizza joint. And as a reporter could actually tell from the scene, it was really weird that this entire story even came to light and even got traction because there was no basement in Comet Ping Pong Pizza at all. So just to say, it doesn't take truth at all. Now, of course, our book Post Factus is not about Donald Trump as such, but there is an extent to which he plays a role. Look at this one here. The leaks are absolutely real, but the news is fake. What does that mean? Just make sure. Now, if we take fake news to be an information product, then maybe it's time to look at what is the reasons for the fake news invasion. In the book, we make an information quality scale where we distinguish between three zones of different statements. True statements, which are the verified facts, doctored statements that could be cherry-picked or framed, undocumented statements, and then zone 3 of the more dubious kind, the lies, the bullshit, and the fake news. Now, what can you use it for? What kind of stories tend to actually follow a fake news recipe, but actually can get traction for a lot of different reasons? Now, you remember this maybe, right? So the first political question that came up when Donald Trump was elected was, how many saw the inauguration? Remember that whole discussion? That was a big deal. And of course, conceptually, they got into some entanglements because Sean Spicer, who was the press secretary of the White House, at some point during this whole debate, actually came out to say, and Aristotle would have a fit. He said, we in the White House can sometimes disagree with the facts. How is that even possible? Right? That doesn't seem possible at all. And yet, of course, he was also backed up by Donald Trump's current advisor, namely Kellyanne Conway, who introduced the notion, and if you're just a little bit of a science person, you're going to find, even anybody would find it hard to believe that there's something called alternative facts. Now, right should be right. That's never what she said. Or that was what she said, but it was not what she meant. She has been out afterwards saying, no, I didn't mean alternative facts. I meant that Sean Spicer was to present alternative information. So 4 equals 2 plus 2, but it also equals 3 plus 1. And that would be truthful, it would be consistent. But that was not what she was quoted for, and for an obvious reason, because there's a lot more traction to be introduced by coming up with a question like alternative facts. So the media was also interested in making her look dumb, even though that's not what she meant. So there is some truth to the fact that they wanted her to say that, because it had a lot of traction. Now, look at these 2 pictures here. I still have like 10 minutes left. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay. Look at these 2 pictures here. This is Barack Obama's inauguration, the first one in 08. In 08, right? 09, yeah? Because January 09, right? Yes. January 09, that's right. And this is Donald Trump's in 17. Yes. Now there's a 20-minute difference between the time these 2 pictures were taken. This is 20 minutes later than that one. So be that as it may. So they're not quite comparable as data points, but pretty close. The question is, if you ask a polarized political landscape what they tend to think about these pictures, so ask the Trump voters what they think about these pictures, a very interesting survey came out, namely that 40% of Donald Trump's voters believe that the picture, which is actually Barack Obama's, is Donald Trump's. That is not too surprising. That's what polarization will do to you. But maybe what is a little more disconcerting is that you can get 15% of the Trump voters to say that there are more people here than there. That's bad news. Because it goes to show that facts just don't matter. And of course, I agree there's a 20 minutes difference in timing, but I mean, still, it's a little surprising after all. But just to say that, of course, in an information warfare, it's not too surprising that truth is the first victim. That's the way it probably would be. And of course, that you also all of a sudden allow for what's called tribalism, but more importantly here, what's called, as a social psychological concept, blue lies. Now, blue lies means that it's okay to lie as long as you do on behalf of your collective or group. It was introduced as a social psychological concept and has actually been proven to be robust. But you were asking New York or American police departments as to the acceptability of lying on behalf of the force. And a lot of police departments in the US are wearing blue, so there hence the concept of blue lies. This is an issue. Now, why is it an issue? Well, it's an issue because it feeds these simple narratives with a clear hero and a clear villain, feeds into this notion we call populism. And the way we discuss populism in the book is not that populism is an ideology, because there is no such thing probably as an ideology, but it's a strategy for partisan mobilization of voter maximization based on very strong us versus them narratives of distrust and exclusion that employs selective cherry picking of facts and issues. And the reason why it's not a political ideology is because we can have different kinds of populists, right? So here's Le Pen, she's probably a right-wing populist. Here is, I love this picture of Geert Wilders, I think it's wonderful. He was also a right-wing. Then, of course, Hugo Chavez was not right-wing, but left-wing. And Nigel Farage and Donald Trump are definitely populists. Their gradient is a little harder, especially for Trump. That was a joke, it wasn't very good, but it was there after all. Now, when you allow for when you have very polarized opinion landscapes, or you can generate these sort of opinion bubbles, you can get people to believe the unbelievable, as we saw with the voting of where the people were the most in the inauguration. But I also took this video with me that I think you should see, just to see what sort of landscape that we're in right now.
This past summer, Trump flag wavers spouted a lot of theories about Hillary Clinton's health.
We see the coughing fits.
She's had, it seems like a number of blood clots.
What on earth could be the reason behind Hillary Clinton's bizarre behavior?
Look, it almost seems seizure-esque to me.
Turns out they were sort of right.
We're now learning she's been diagnosed with pneumonia.
If the crackpots halfway nailed one theory, maybe their truth fingers were in deeper than mine. I had to find out. I headed to Trump rallies in the crucial swing states of Ohio and Wisconsin to discover what his supporters know that the rest of us don't. Do you think it's worse than pneumonia?
Yes.
What do you think's going on?
It could be Parkinson's, it could be MS.
It could be AIDS.
What makes you think she has AIDS?
Where her husband used to be.
Do you think Bill had AIDS? So how did Bill Clinton get AIDS?
Probably messing around with that Magic Johnson.
That's the natural conclusion?
Yes.
Interesting. The Clintons and Magic Johnson. What else do they know?
They're saying there's like a double of her.
Do you think there was a Hillary Clinton double?
Yeah.
I think anything's possible when it comes to doubles.
Wow, a Clinton double. Who knew? So I printed out 2 identical photos to see if they could see what we couldn't. Which one's the body double? Well, what is it about this one that makes you think it's not Hillary Clinton?
That little thing on her cheek is very obvious, and the scarring or whatever this is down her throat is different.
They look a ton alike, right?
This one's a little bit younger.
You think this one's younger?
Yeah.
But don't you think you just look at something for long enough and you kind of have a paranoid mind, eventually you'll find a difference maybe?
Yeah, I think something like that's possible. Yeah.
Which one are you more attracted to? No. Yeah. Uncovering Hillary's doubles is one thing, but what did they tell us about our current commander-in-chief?
Well, Obama is a Muslim, he's a terrorist. Nobody will ever tell him different.
We don't even know he's a citizen.
Yeah, if you don't look at the birth certificate, there's almost no evidence then.
Exactly.
So there's nothing Barack Obama can do to prove that he was born here.
If there was maybe witnesses that were attendants at his birth.
And his mother, do you listen to mother?
No, she hasn't lived patient alive.
You don't trust Donald Trump's birth certificate either.
Yeah, because he's been here forever.
How do you know? What's your proof?
Well, his parents and.
No, but they're biased. I'm talking about these people who
Why
can
would they be biased?
Well, like, I'm just using your logic against you.
Okay.
He acts like a Muslim, he talks like a Muslim. He also does the Muslim principles as far as jewelry is concerned.
Jewelry?
Yeah, jewelry. Certain months of the year, not wearing his wedding ring.
That's a deep cut. You want me to connect your necklace to Christianity?
Why would you do that?
You just talking. I didn't even know people were connecting jewelry to religion.
Muslims don't wear.
And a Jew watch? And one of the most unbelievable discoveries yet.
Barack Obama had a big part of 9/11.
Which part?
Not being around, always on vacation, never in the office.
Why do you think Barack Obama wasn't in the Oval Office on 9/11?
That I don't know. I'd like to get to the bottom of that.
Wow, mind blown.
Okay, I don't actually know how to proceed from here, right? That's a little hard. And look, but I think what is fair to say, though, the worst thing you can do is to say this is the stupid Rust Belt, the unenlightened, because then it's just a different kind of populism, right? So it goes both ways. The question is, how did we get there? Now, of course, right now we're having all these discussions about, say, Russian meddling in the U.S. election, and there's definitely something probably true to it. But let's look at the inertia of the market for information. Now, there was a very, very interesting review in the Columbia Journalism Review, where they've been trying to trace the fake news stories, where they came from and how they proliferated. And one of the interesting things that they found was that a closed ecosystem of news outlets in the US are centered around Breitbart News, but also with truthfed.com, Go End the Feds, Gateway Pundits, were actually able to push these fake news stories out to the Trumpian voter landscape, but in such a way that they were so noisy, that they were using such language that it was a zero-sum game for the established media. Because if New York Times didn't take up the story, the Washington Post would. If CNN didn't take it up, the ABC would, and so for MSNBC and the rest of the networks. And so that basically went to show that even independent on whether or not you were for or against the stories, it was a zero-sum game on the attention. And what did you get out of that? Agenda setting across the board. Everybody was discussing the same thing. And even worse than that, you could also say, well, maybe that's because Breitbart and company used a lot of bots to generate the information, get in circulation. No. A recent study from Science goes to show that we are a lot better at proliferating fake news stories than bots are. First of all, fake news proliferates a lot better than truthful stories or balanced stories. But worse than that, it's not the bots doing it, it's us doing it. And the reason is, bots are not intelligent enough now that when they look at tweets, that they can see if people are not using fear, anger, and indignation, which fake news stories are mostly centered on, this other study shows, the context in which they are said, the computers are not smart enough to figure out what the context is if people are not using anger, fear, indignation as words. And that goes to show, when you look at the proliferation patterns, that the ones who are really good at doing these fake news stories and proliferating it in a system is not computers and algorithms, it's us, humans. And why? Because it feeds into our activity mobilizing sentiments. So there's a very strong reason for them actually proliferating very strongly, because it proliferates just like fascination and awe stories that we saw before, or this story from Justin Seiko. It's the same sort of proliferation pattern that we find. Last but not least, where does all this take us? Well, I will stop with that in 2 minutes. It will take us to what is known as the post-factual democracy, or a democracy in a post-factual state. And the way in which we define that is that a democracy is in a post-factual state when opportune political narratives but factually incorrect information replace facts and evidence as basis for political debate, opinion formation, and policy making. Now, we are not claiming that it's either or. We are claiming that between technocracy in one end, which is only the necessity of political decisions based only on evidence, and the post-factual as a limit point in the other end, democracies are on this sliding scale. And there will be tendency, depending on zeitgeist and whatnot, to go one in the other direction. Now, if attention economics is to survive, it's because put it this way, attention economics will always survive in an information age. That's the part of the fabric. The problem is, of course, that if we keep not understanding the way in which attention is allocated, we're going to get fooled again and again. And the way in which the media platforms are using it, I'm sure that maybe Zuckerberg wasn't aware of attention economics, but I'm pretty sure both Larry Page and Peter Thiel, they understood what this thing was about. Now, why is this a problem? Well, because in a post-factual democracy, it doesn't really matter about whether or not you can cash in your political promises as long as you can get you can vote or maximize. Now, suppose we take this to the limit and having a world in which the ones who are in power are the ones with a lot of attention online as the primary asset. What would that look like? Well, it would look like a world in which Kanye West would make president of the United States of America. And you might say that's laughable, but Kanye West has actually said, to those who don't know who he is, he makes shoes and he's a rapper. Good for him. He actually has said that he's going to run for president in 2024, so that's not too long off. Now, Kanye West is married to Kim Kardashian. Okay, so suppose he becomes president, and suppose we continue to look at the way in which we have appointments in the White House along the lines of Donald Trump that would make her Secretary of State. Okay? So Kanye West is president, Kim Kardashian is Secretary of State. In Denmark, it would mean that reality stars would take over would take over the primary minister. And the same would go for Germany and so forth. And then, of course, I think we're going to have to run for cover then. That's going to be a very tough world to live in. And you might say, Vincent, that's never going to happen. That's dystopia. It's never going to happen. And then I'll just have to tell you, though, I mean, you know, we did get this guy, right? So we are in part there. Now, where does all this take us? Well, it takes us to one place, namely, and that's going to be my last words. World Economic Forum has been pushing the following message since 2013. They said that the global risk of massive digital misinformation sits at the center of a constellation of technological and geopolitical risks, ranging from terrorism to cyber attacks and the failure of global governance. Now, what they are saying between the lines is that misinformation is now to be understood as a global challenge, on par with climate, migration, inequality, healthcare, inclusive growth, et cetera, et cetera. That's where we're at. And why? Well, basically because it threatens democracy. The same goes for the Munich Security Council report from last year: disinformation, fake it, leak it, and spread it. So what we are doing at the Center for Information and Bubble Studies at the end is to look at exactly the way in which the information market is put together between attention and information, and the ways in which you can actually bar some of these unfortunate market conditions from proliferating, but also to looking at the dynamics and computations of socio-psychological phenomena. I think I'll follow Donald Trump in saying that's all I have to say about that. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Very exciting talk. We know this.
Sure.
Why don't we take them? I mean, George Lakoff,
Right.
since ages, trying to lecture in the Democratic Party, even publish a very popular book, Don't Think of an Elephant.
Right.
And the media kept covering all the BS spreading out of the pretty phone of Donald Trump.
Sure.
So they know it, but so what prevails is the profit logic, so they make big sales, selling this
Yes.
BS stuff.
If you're looking at the media, then of course the established media, they are in a fix right now, right? Because one of the things that you get out of liberalizing the information superhighways is that everybody can has a voice now. But these voices are a very different nature. If you look at established media, right, they have very strong regulations as to what they can actually proliferate for information and still obey the excellence in journalism principles. Good stories take a long time to write, take a long time to research, whereas fake news stories can be put together very fastly. And so the production cost of your product is very different. And as long as that keeps to be in the market, then there is still going to be a market for subprime products, if you wish, but it has a lot of proliferation possibilities and hence a lot of attention allocation. So we have to look at the way in which, is the market for information possible to regulate? Well, that's actually the discussion running right now in the EU and other places. Even the American Parliament is also discussing this issue.
But this thing's come from a long way. I mean, even before the age of fake news.
Sure.
The impression I got talking to people in the U.S. was that the Republicans, the conservative camp, was much smarter than the liberal to understand what really drives people's opinion. A much better use of metaphors.
Right.
With respect to the right. The left.
Right.
Even in my country, the left believes that you just need to have figures to realize what decision to take.
Right.
So George Lakoff was using
Sure.
tax relief,
Right.
which turned out to be incredibly successful.
Right.
To convince people
Right.
that having a flat rate is better for everyone.
Right.
While the opposite is true.
Right.
So why they don't get it?
Well, okay, so, well, I'm not the Messiah, so I can't speak. But one,
You probably thought.
sure. But I mean, we have to look at this. I mean, one of the things that we are really studying intensively at the center are biases, right? And biases are nasty beasts because biases are usually, biases are independent of facts. And facts, when in a biased society, actually just bolsters more bias. So right now you have this idea that stick people some more truthful information and they'll change their opinions. Wrong. They don't change their opinions for a host of different psychological or social psychological reasons. One of the things that unfortunately is very true, and we have actually some studies of that, is that when it comes to changing your opinion, one of the things that really will animate you not to is cognitive dissonance, right? So the idea that a piece of information comes in which is contrary to your beliefs, and instead of changing your behavior, you just change your beliefs a little bit in a way to say, but that's also because it's a conspiracy from the opposite party, etc. So there's a lot of social psychology or psychology feeding into the reason why we are not changing our beliefs, and the reason why, for instance, some of the media outlets are not changing and not focusing on these things seems to be the case from the studies that we have found so far by us and others, that they are in no small measure based on the way in which the attention economics favors stories that are wrongful but attention allocating. Yes, sir.
So regarding the question why we don't take action, I'm just asking myself, like,
Sure.
what actions are at stake?
Right. Okay. So we have an EU commissioner right now who is, we are very proud to say, Dane McGrady in the commission, who has basically been after the big tech companies with fining them, for instance, on various ways that they have been conducting their business. And this is actually going and turning into a whole program of various measures to see if we can sort of block these tendencies for the ways in which this information and the way the users are being used or other products. So one of the things that are being discussed right now is it okay, based also the Cambridge Analytica scandal and Facebook, is we don't own our data, right? So the big companies own the data and they can sell them to third parties. Is that okay? Well, should it be such that whatever data that you are generating is yours and you can decide as to whether or not they can be used for third-party use? So one part of taking back the autonomy of the user is to let them own their data. Another question is, another point that has been out there is, well, let the big tech companies having to set out their algorithms so we can see what's going on. That's never going to happen. It'll never happen. It's like asking Coca-Cola to give up their recipe for Coca-Cola. It's not going to happen. But what might happen, though, is that one way to take back the autonomy is, for both states but also for independent users, is that even if you're a super libertarian, don't interfere, don't mess the market, let it deregulate and let's see what happens. Even libertarians don't like trusts in the sense of saying they don't like monopolies. And what we are having on the information market right now is an extreme amount of market concentration. An international HHI index will tell you that you say that a market is very concentrated, that means on a few hands, if it has an HHI index of 2,000. It's very concentrated if the HHI index is 2,500. And a recent survey came out recently that goes to show that on the information market, the HHI index is 7,500. So one of the things that you could speculate in is if you have this much market concentration, maybe you should start using antitrust laws to break them up. It's not allowed for Amazon to own Washington Post and Amazon at the same time. And if you do, you have to make darn sure that there are very, very strong discrepancies between the two. So just to say, there is something about regulating the market. There is something about taking the autonomy back to the users. And then there is also a giant element of digital education. We have to understand, and that's actually one of the things that we've been studying very intensively at the center. How do you break bad habits of a social psychological nature? So take something like pluralistic ignorance, like majority mistakes. So nobody likes getting, if you look as teenagers how they feel about getting smashed on the weekends, they don't personally like getting smashed on the weekends, but they wrongfully believe that a majority of their friends thinks it's a lot more cool than they think themselves, so they collectively subscribe to a norm that they privately reject. That's called a majority mistake. That goes for loss of risk behavior. You can also actually find on corporate boards when they make decisions. There's a whole span of places where you can find these majority mistakes. There are also questions as to what you do about them. Now, if you tell people you can't drink, if me and my wife, we tell our son, you can't drink this weekend, and they're teenagers, they're going to go, sure. And they'll do it. Well, maybe not so much anymore, but just to say that the paternalistic finger doesn't work. And it doesn't work either not to do anything. That's also shown as a control group. But what has turned out to actually work is that if you explain people the structure and the dynamics of a majority mistake, that can might be a preventive measure as to when they'll do it again. They have to understand that their conception is a misconception of the distribution of standpoints in a group. And that information in and by itself can actually be a preventive measure. So, digital education is also about understanding both the structure of the market and the structure of, say, social psychological dynamics that make us walk the right direction when we should go the right direction. So there's a whole spread, but you can see it's from regulation in the one end to digital education on the other. And we are probably going to need a generation or two before we get this problem fixed as ever. Yes, sir? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
First, a quick comment on market concentration. The Google algorithm is dependent on concentration.
Yeah.
And that's a problem. And breaking of Google will decrease the value of the service.
Yes, sir.
So that's good. A notion you introduced, which I think should be stressed
Yeah.
It's not propositional centric. And philosophy has made the mistake for 20 years suggesting the truth is proposition centric. It is not. The smallest unit of meaning is a narrative. And narratives can be most easily manipulated, structured
Yes.
positively or negatively in terms of one of the themes of this conference by affectivity.
Yep.
And once we put those two concepts together, we're in a position to take measures of an educational nature that might be more directly appropriate.
Yes.
The other thing I'd just like to add as a comment was left out of your presentation, as mentioned, the news is entertainment.
Yes. Yeah.
Entertainment drives so much
Yeah.
of the web.
Yeah.
And then news can piggyback that,
Yeah.
or fake news
Yeah.
can piggyback that.
Yeah.
Which you showed in your list of the 5 most followed people on Twitter.
Right.
They're all
Yeah. No, I totally agree. Let me.
Donald Trump made himself as an
Yeah.
entertainer.
Yeah.
On The Apprentice.
No, I think I lay flat for your comments. The only reason it took me a long time to accept the first point that you were making. I come from logic, right? And I come from formal logic and formal math. And there, truth is propositional. And you can map propositions to truth, and then you can granulate your values, your denotation sets and stuff like that. But when we started getting into this business, then it became clear that yes, there are certain things that you can still map very easily, but you don't need much complexity in the problems before truth tends to get more narrative. And that is really an issue. And I have to agree with you there. So it's a different kind of analysis, or it's a much stronger multidisciplinary analysis that's going to be needed in order to tackle these issues. And that's also the reason why we try to put the center together on that note. Yes, ma'am.
Kind of polemical question. There's a novel that everyone knows called The Echo Paragon. And he says, the author, that for everything to stay the same, everything must change. It's a kind of wisdom. And if we look at this situation, we see a situation which, first of all, as Victoria said, has an old story also in, for example, Berlusconi and so-called not truthful things said through the media that we own.
Sure.
And so forth. But if we go further back, it's typical of fascist states, like in, or United States, to control the facts and to make the different facts. Okay, so if we think paradoxically, we could think opposite way of what you're saying, which is not how to fix through education, digital education, the problem, which I would say is a reformist proposition, and which is a very optimistic one. But we could also think to change something else, which is to change the democratic system. In other words, if parliamentary democracy with universal suffrage was adequate to the moments of history in which newspapers were being born, let's say the coffee shops of the 1700s
Sure.
and 1800s, especially with its gradual growth, we could say that this technology does not adequately produce a political system which is based on universal suffrage of democracy. So we could also invent, what do you think about the possibilities of invention of other forms of representation which might be based on other ways and that might also be more inclusive of the non-human in what we call governance of the planet.
Yeah.
Because these cannot go and vote. But why should these be different from, let's say, women could not go and vote until...
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Right.
In Italy, my mother was the first generation who voted,
Right.
even though there was considered to be democracy before that. So
Right.
the excluded are obviously not part of the citizenship,
No.
therefore it's democracy working even though the excluded are not voting. So we are in this
I'm not sure I can come up with an answer to that. But what I like about your thinking is to say, well, look, in the information age, we now have new sorts of entities. And these sort of new entities also have to be factored in. And the way in which we have been looking at democracy so far might actually not be up to date anymore. I guess that's also what you're saying. I am sympathetic to the idea. I don't know, I think, I don't know how to do what you're asking, but I think there is one danger in it. And there are many dangers, but one of the things that democracy is based on is that there's at least one vote, but that a robust democracy, of course, is not just one vote, because then that would make it easy. Just get the dictator out and get people to vote, and then you're all running on full steam. You need an informed vote, and that's a whole different beast. And as soon as you say an informed vote, you get the conundrum that you are addressing there. You might go that direction. But so far, what is it that Winston Churchill said, right? A democracy is the worst kind of government, except all the forms that we had tried before.
Yes, he said it a long time ago.
Right.
Currently, it's the oldest system on the planet. I mean, if you think in a way, monarchies are not really.
No, but look.
But I agree that it's an old thing said, and I just wanted to know your opinion on the Gato position, which is for everything to stay the same, everything has to change. And if you
Okay, I think that's a very good point. Look, I don't think I agree with the fact that democracy is the oldest way in which that's not what you said. I mean, if you're... Okay, continuously maybe, but I think it's fair to say that as a species, we are about 250,000 years old, give or take, right? Our understanding of democracy goes back to Greek antiquity, but that was not democracy, because no children, no slaves, could vote. So that's not democracy. So it's an Enlightenment concept, right? So that's a very recent addition to human ways of understanding government. And instead of maybe changing the system, I think we are not the best we have to understand that we still have to custode this thing. We have to maintain democracy on a continuous basis. So instead of changing the system, we have to adapt it to a new reality. I think that is true, but still maintain the nuts and bolts of what we got. Pace Churchill. That's my 2 cents.
I think that democracy needs really seriously adjustment in order to maintain democracy. So this is actually what you were, I think, addressing to. The way it is, it's not working. And so maybe in changing, I was also interested about this law of power that you mentioned, or power of law. Like, how can we change that?
Yeah.
Do you consider that a natural law, or is that
No.
maybe socialization?
I think the natural way of things, if we're looking at pace democracy, the best way of ordering things would be according to normal distributions, right? That would be the best. Because then that averages out differences such that the bulk basically have the same. The problem is here, of course, that attention allocation pays the business model of attention economics does not favor that kind of distribution. It's like asking, how do we get rid of inequality? How do we get rid of the power laws of inequality?
Yeah.
You can do progressive taxes and you can do reorganizations of wealth, but that's going to cost something.
But this is my question, coming back to my question.
Right.
Is it a natural law? Would you consider it a natural law?
No.
The law of inequality as well as this law of attention?
No. I don't think it's a natural law. I don't think it's a natural law, but I think it's a consequence of the way in which you have made an information into something that you can buy and sell. And as soon as you can do that, then it tends to favor the ones who have a lot. And let me try to boast of this point also. Now, there is this argument out there that we all now have access, that from that perspective, in principle, we should be able to allocate the same amount of attention in everybody else. Wrong. Studies are unequivocal on this point. The ones who have a lot get more, even on Twitter. Okay? So there's a reason why Donald Trump had the upper hand here. It favors the elite. It doesn't favor the layman. It doesn't. It just doesn't. But as long as you were right about saying, Victoria, that the narratives are very strong here, so the entire idea that you can get people to think that there's a democratic process in it, even better. But that's not the truth of the matter. So what I'm trying to say is, one way to get rid of some of these inequality businesses, as we're looking at attention, economics, and information, is exactly in part via regulation. Tax it.
Nudging?
Tax it, nudging, whatever it takes. But you have, but probably, or taxing, regulating, educating, etc., etc. And then I'm still leaving out an answer to you properly, actually, whether or not do we have to get back to the same baseline? I'm not sure. I don't know. Are we still looking about the same sort of democracy? I'm just a logician.
What's going on in China?
But okay, so let me just look. It's an interesting thing right now, right? So there's this whole, one of my PhD students that I wrote the book with Mass there is very interested in what's called digital totalitarianism, yeah? So what you're going on in China right now is basically that you start giving people social capital as to a trust index that the state provides. And that is going to and that is actually going to feed into what kind of privileges you're going to get. That's digital totalitarianism. But you know, tell me one thing. There's no difference between what China is doing right now and what Amazon Echo and Google Assistant are doing right now. Take this microphone and stick it in your house. And when you need toilet paper for the guest bathroom, it will take care of that. But it'll also take care of everything else, including surveillance at all times. And that's the same thing. So one is based on C was out the other day saying we are going back to Marxism now, but pragmatic capitalism. Whatever that means. And on the other hand, you have Amazon and company. On the other hand, in the end, they're pretty much alike. I mean, it's digital totalitarianism, either based on free choice or no free choice, but no free choice, no matter.
Coming back to the question of like, if we should adjust democracy, or I mean, in the end, what is the expression of democracy today? So maybe it's not about gaining as many votes for one purpose.
Sure.
It's about like coming to decisions in order to enable actions.
Right.
Maybe.
Right.
And so the question would be like, what's the meaning of democracy and why are we performing it, and how can we put that in practice again, besides doing what everyone else does and has done in the last 20, 30 years and putting that to.
Boy, I mean, there's really the profound, deep questions that you're asking. I don't have all those answers, but I think it's fair to say that democracy is not about, put it this way, baseline is democracy is not only about voter maximization, right? I mean, there's got to be more to it. Because otherwise it becomes an optimization problem, and those we know, right? Or faith, or... I agree with that, but at least we know some of the things that democracy is not. And democracy, I think robust democracies are characterized by people having informed voice, having to able to make informed decisions. And the information age should actually put us in a lot better place. And it probably also has, but there are pitfalls to this progress. And let me, you know, I talk with this with my wife ever so often, and you know, we have 4 teenage children, right? We have 4 kids, and you know, many years ago, one of them asked me, I received a prize in Denmark, and that morning I had to go in and get the prize. He asked me the following questions. He asked me first, he was 8 years old at the time, he asked me first, Dad, what is it that you do? That's a good question. But the follow-up is even better. And why is it important? And why is it important? Now that's a good question. Because I think it's fair to say that at a point now in time, everything from scientists to artists have to take upon themselves a role as actors in civil society. It's not just good enough to sit and, I got this prize for some very complicated topological studies of knowledge transmissibility for limit conditions. I had 2.5 readers every paper, that was it, okay? And then recently, our other son, we were going home from a conference in the middle of the night, and he asked me, he said, look, every time I open up my cell phone, I feel like somebody is trying to screw me over. And he would be right about that. He would be right, because everybody's trying to fight for his attention, all right? So they're darn aware that there is an issue going on here. And I think it's fair to say that one of the most meaningful things I've been doing in science is doing this, because I don't want to be the first generation on this planet Earth that leaves a condition on planet Earth which is in a worse condition from the ones I got from my parents. And you might say, that's not the case. And I'm like, yes, it is the case, because things are adding up. There's a reason why the UN has 17 goals. There's a reason why the OECD has similar. And there's a reason why the World Economic Forum has 10 challenges to the world. And they're happening now. So we have to start worrying about the solutions, not tomorrow, not after breakfast. It means now. Yes, sir.
It's just a suggestion. This is a what if. What if we move in the direction of trying to socialize, as it were, some major utilities like the information utility? What if the government, which represents us, owned the telephone transmission? Then you would not have advertisers competing for your attention.
That's true.
And it would be a neutral vehicle.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult to make that
Yeah,
happen.
yeah.
But that's the direction you want to move, taking large, shots on goal.
Sure.
Offsetting your carbon footprint by an airline ticket.
Right.
It's good the other way around.
Yeah. Well, I know it's not concentrating. They're
The
moving
populists want less taxes, they want
Sorry, I
to
know.
public roads to make money, and
I know the direction it's going. Let me add something here. All of us, most of us are in despair about American democracy at this point, and none more than me. That election was lost by a lot of young liberals who sat on the sidelines, did not vote for Hillary because she wasn't exciting enough for them. That's what happened. You count the votes. And the Democrats are now smartly mobilizing against that. Will they be able to turn toward her tide in 2020? I have to think so. But it's not as if American democracy really crashed and burned because of all the some people out there for the right. It's because, well-meaning liberals sat on the sidelines. That's what I think.
And I think also, and that's one of the reasons. And another thing of the reason is that if you look at this plot I had before about the Facebook analysis and of these stories, I think it's fair to say that a lot of the established media hadn't figured out this model. I mean, they hadn't figured out how attention economics works. They hadn't figured that it's all about agenda setting. It's not about truth, necessarily.
Well, they figured out to this extent that it was more fashionable to write a negative story about Hillary than it was to write one about Trump.
Right.
And you know the media analysis on that.
Sure.
As a matter of fact, there were massively more negative stories, even for the New York Times.
Right.
Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, but that only goes to show that there's a lot of readers in that, right? So from that perspective, they understood it. But what they might not have understood was that they were actually also they were vehicles now, right? They were actually the horses behind. They were horses pulling carts that they didn't really want. From that perspective, especially because of the zero-sum game of the attention economics. Maybe. Okay, is that it? Yeah. That's it. Thank you.